Ruth Sinclair felt the gun barrel press cold against her spine before she heard the voice. She'd been reaching for the saddle cinch when the metal touched her back, and her hands froze in midair, still holding the leather strap she'd been checking. The horse, a rented mare from the stage station 20 miles back, shifted nervously. "Drop the reins," the man said. His voice carried authority and something else, something tired. Slow. Ruth let the leather fall. Her heart hammered, but her mind stayed clear. She'd come to Cedar Creek to save Juniper Ranch from foreclosure, not to get shot in the street her first hour in town. "Turn around," he said. "Hands where I can see them." She turned. The deputy stood 3 feet away, his gun steady, his face shadowed by the brim of his hat. Dark blonde hair touched his collar. Light stubble covered a jaw that looked like it had forgotten how to unclench. His brown duster hung open, revealing a black vest, a deputy badge, and a gun belt that had seen plenty of use. His eyes were gray, hard as winter sky, and they studied her with the focus of a man who'd learned not to trust first impressions. "You're Clara Dean," he said. It wasn't a question. "I have a warrant." Ruth stared at him. "I'm Ruth Sinclair. I don't know who Clara Dean is, but you're making a mistake." The gun didn't waver. "Clara Dean robbed the Laramie stage 3 weeks ago. Shot the driver in the shoulder. You match the description. Brown hair and a travel dress?" Ruth kept her voice level. That must narrow it down to half the women west of the Mississippi. His jaw tightened. The witness said she wore a cream blouse and carried a carpet bag with a broken clasp. He nodded toward the bag on the ground near her feet. "That clasp looks plenty broken to me." Ruth's stomach dropped. The clasp had snapped 2 days ago when she'd shoved too many ledgers inside, trying to bring everything she'd need to prove the ranch's finances were sound. "My name is Ruth Sinclair," she said again. "I'm here to see my uncle's lawyer about Juniper Ranch. I have papers." "So did Clara Dean," the deputy said. "Stolen ones." A small crowd had started to gather. Ruth saw faces in doorways. A woman with a market basket pausing on the boardwalk. 2 men stepping out of the saloon to watch. Heat crawled up her neck. She'd imagined arriving in Cedar Creek quietly, slipping into the lawyer's office, fixing the mess her late uncle had left behind. She had not imagined being held at gunpoint in the street like a common criminal. "Check my bag," Ruth said. "You'll find ledgers, correspondence from my uncle, and a letter from his lawyer asking me to come. No stolen stage money." The deputy's eyes flicked to the carpet bag, but he didn't lower the gun. "I'll check it at the jail." "You'll check it right here," Ruth said, her temper finally snapping loose. "Because I'm not going anywhere with you until you admit you've made a mistake. My uncle was Samuel Sinclair. He owned Juniper Ranch until he died 4 months ago. His lawyer, a man named Howard Marsh, sent me a telegram saying the ranch was about to be foreclosed unless I could prove the accounts were in order. I came here to save my family's land, not to rob stages." Something shifted in the deputy's face. The hardness didn't leave, but a flicker of uncertainty crossed his eyes. "Samuel Sinclair," he repeated. "Yes." Ruth kept her hands up, but her voice gained strength. "He raised me after my parents died. I did his books for years before I moved to Kansas City. He left the ranch to me in his will, but someone's been doctoring the records. Howard Marsh says the bank claims my uncle owed money he never borrowed. If I can't prove the accounts are clean, they'll take Juniper Ranch in 3 days." The deputy studied her for a long moment. Then he lowered the gun, though he didn't holster it. "What's your uncle's lawyer's address?" "2 buildings past the land office," Ruth said. "Second floor." The deputy turned his head slightly, addressing a man in the crowd. "Caleb, go fetch Howard Marsh. Tell him it's urgent." The man nodded and jogged off. The deputy looked back at Ruth, and she saw the exhaustion in his face now. The lines around his eyes that spoke of too many long nights and too few answers. "If you're lying," he said quietly, "you'll hang." "If I'm lying," Ruth said, "you can apologize after I'm cleared." His mouth twitched. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. "That's not how apologies work." "Then you'll learn." They stood in the dusty street, the gun still in his hand, the crowd still watching, until a man in a gray suit hurried toward them, his spectacles glinting in the afternoon sun. Howard Marsh was thin, 60, with ink-stained fingers and a perpetually worried expression. He took one look at Ruth, and relief washed over his face. "Miss Sinclair," he said, breathless. "Thank God. I was afraid you wouldn't come." The deputy glanced at Marsh, then back at Ruth. He holstered his gun. "My mistake," he said. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded angry, but Ruth had the sense the anger wasn't aimed at her. Marsh stepped between them, fussing. "Deputy Turner, really? Miss Sinclair is here on legitimate business. If you'd checked with me first, this entire misunderstanding could have been avoided." Deputy Turner, Ruth thought. So that was his name, Orson Turner. She'd heard it once in her uncle's letters, a passing mention of the new deputy who'd come to Cedar Creek after the war. A man who kept to himself and did his job without fuss. Her uncle had liked him. "Steady," Samuel had written. "Doesn't talk much, but he listens." Orson picked up Ruth's carpetbag and handed it to her, his expression unreadable. "Welcome to Cedar Creek, Miss Sinclair." He tipped his hat, a gesture so brief it almost wasn't there, and walked away, his duster swirling dust as he went. Ruth watched him go, her heart still racing. She turned to Howard Marsh. "What just happened?" Marsh sighed. "Clara Dean's been hitting stages all over the territory. The county's offering a reward. Orson's been tracking her for 2 weeks. He's under a lot of pressure to bring her in. And I look like her." Marsh hesitated. "You match the description. But so do a dozen other women." He should have checked with me first. He looked genuinely distressed. "I'm so sorry, Miss Sinclair. This isn't the welcome you deserved." Ruth picked up her bag. The clasp dangled uselessly. "It's fine," she said, though it wasn't. "Let's go to your office. We need to talk about the ranch." Marsh's office was small and cluttered, every surface covered with papers, ledgers, and legal files. He cleared a chair for Ruth, and she sat, grateful to be off her feet. The stage ride had been long and rough, and the confrontation with Orson Turner had drained what little energy she had left. Marsh pulled a thick file from his desk. "Your uncle's estate," he said. "It's a mess, Miss Sinclair." "I won't lie to you." Ruth opened the file. Inside were bank statements, loan documents, and a sheaf of correspondence that made her stomach tighten. "Show me the loans." Marsh spread the papers across the desk. 3 loans, he said, taken out over the past year. Total of $8,000. The bank says your uncle signed the notes himself. Ruth scanned the signatures. They looked like her uncle's hand, but something felt wrong. The pen pressure was uneven, the flourish on the S too short. Her uncle had been a meticulous man, his signature as steady as his character. "These don't match," she said. "Someone forged them." Marsh leaned closer. "Are you certain?" Ruth had kept her uncle's books for 15 years. She knew his handwriting better than her own. "I'm certain." She looked up. "Who holds the notes?" Marsh's face darkened. "A man named Victor Calhoun. He came to Cedar Creek about 2 years ago, bought the old Fletcher place, and started lending money to every rancher in the valley. Half the town owes him now. And if they can't pay," Ruth said slowly, "he takes their land." Marsh nodded. "Your uncle never borrowed a dime from Calhoun. I'd stake my reputation on it." But Calhoun showed up with these notes 3 weeks after Samuel died, and the bank verified the signatures. "If you can't prove they're forged, the ranch goes to auction in 3 days." Ruth's hands tightened on the papers. "I need to see Calhoun's records. If he forged my uncle's signature, he's done it to others. There'll be a pattern." Marsh looked uneasy. "Calhoun keeps his files locked up tight. No one gets access without his say-so." "Then I'll get his say-so," Ruth said. Marsh shook his head. "Miss Sinclair, Victor Calhoun is not a man you want to cross. He's got half the county in his pocket, and the other half is too scared to speak against him." "I didn't come here to be scared," Ruth said. She stood, tucking the file under her arm. "Where can I find him?" Marsh hesitated, then sighed. "He keeps an office in the back of the land office. But he's not there now. He's at the Copper Bell. That's the saloon at the end of the street. He does most of his business there." Ruth nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Marsh. I'll be in touch." She left the office and stepped into the late afternoon sun. The street was quieter now. The crowd from earlier dispersed. She walked toward the Copper Bell, her heart beating hard, but her steps steady. If Victor Calhoun thought he could steal her family's ranch with forged papers, he was about to learn otherwise. The Copper Bell was bigger than she'd expected, with a wide porch and swinging doors that opened onto a dim interior. Ruth paused at the threshold. She'd been in saloons before, back when her uncle needed her to collect debts from men who thought a woman's presence meant they could avoid paying. She knew how to walk into a room full of men and make herself heard. She pushed through the doors. The air inside smelled of whiskey, tobacco, and old wood. A dozen men sat at tables, playing cards or drinking in silence. A few looked up when she entered. One whistled low. The bartender, a heavy man with a stained apron, frowned. Ruth ignored them all. She scanned the room until she found him. Victor Calhoun sat at a corner table, a stack of papers in front of him, a glass of whiskey at his elbow. He was older than she'd expected, maybe 50, with silver hair and a face that might have been handsome once, but had gone soft with easy living. He wore a fine suit, too fine for Cedar Creek, and his hands were smooth, unmarked by work. Ruth walked straight to his table. "Mr. Calhoun." He looked up, his expression mildly curious. "And who might you be?" "Ruth Sinclair. My uncle was Samuel Sinclair. You hold notes on his ranch." Calhoun's smile was slow and cold. "Ah, Miss Sinclair. I'd heard you were coming to town." He gestured to the chair across from him. "Please, sit." Ruth stayed standing. "I've seen the loan documents. They're forged." Calhoun's smile didn't waver. That's a serious accusation. It's a fact, Ruth said. My uncle never borrowed money from you. You faked his signature to steal his land. The room had gone quiet. Ruth felt eyes on her back, but she didn't turn. Calhoun leaned back in his chair, studying her with the lazy confidence of a man who knew he held all the cards. Your uncle's signature is on file with the bank, he said. They verified it. If you have proof otherwise, I suggest you take it up with them. I will, Ruth said. And when I prove those notes are fake, you'll answer for fraud. Calhoun's smile finally faded. Miss Sinclair, he said softly, you're new here. You don't understand how things work. Your uncle owed money. I'm simply collecting what's owed. If you'd like to settle the debt and keep the ranch, I'm willing to negotiate. Otherwise, the auction proceeds as scheduled. I'm not paying a debt that doesn't exist, Ruth said. Then you'll lose the ranch. Calhoun picked up his glass. Good day, Miss Sinclair. Ruth turned and walked out, her pulse pounding in her ears. She'd expected denial, maybe anger, but Calhoun's calm certainty rattled her. He acted like a man who knew he couldn't lose. That meant he had protection. Someone in Cedar Creek was helping him. Someone with enough power to make forged documents look legitimate. She was halfway down the street when she heard boots behind her. She turned. Orson Turner stood a few paces back, his hat pulled low, his expression unreadable. You just made an enemy, he said. I made an enemy the moment I arrived, Ruth said. He's been stealing from my family. Orson stepped closer. His voice dropped. Calhoun's dangerous. He's got ties to people you don't want to cross. If you're smart, you'll take what you can get and leave town. Ruth stared at him. Are you telling me to let him steal my ranch? I'm telling you to stay alive, Orson said. His gray eyes held hers. There's more at stake here than one ranch. Calhoun's not working alone. He's got backing from men who don't care about the law. If you push this, they'll push back. Hard. Ruth's anger flared. So I should just give up? Let him take everything my uncle built? Orson's jaw tightened. I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? He looked away, toward the horizon where the sun was sinking low, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. I'm saying be careful. That's all. He started to walk away, but Ruth caught his arm. Her hand closed around the rough fabric of his duster. Wait. He turned, surprised. Why do you care? She asked. You don't know me. You held a gun on me an hour ago. Orson looked at her hand on his arm, then at her face. Something in his expression shifted, softened just slightly. Your uncle was a good man, he said quietly. He helped me when I first came to Cedar Creek. Gave me work when no one else would. I owe him. That means I owe you. Ruth let go of his arm. You knew him well? Well enough. Orson's voice was rough. He didn't deserve what happened. What did happen? Ruth asked. Marsh said he died of a heart failure, but no one seems to want to talk about it. Orson hesitated. Then he glanced around, checking the street. Not here. Meet me at the livery stable after dark. I'll tell you what I know. Ruth nodded. She watched him walk away, his long coat swirling dust, and tried to make sense of the knot tightening in her chest. Orson Turner was a complication she hadn't planned for. He was guarded, rough-edged, and clearly keeping secrets. But there'd been something in his eyes when he mentioned her uncle, a flicker of genuine grief. If he'd cared about Samuel, maybe he'd care enough to help her save Juniper Ranch. She spent the rest of the afternoon at the boarding house Marsh had recommended, a narrow 2-story building run by a widow named Mrs. Hale. The room was small but clean, with a lumpy bed, a washstand, and a window that overlooked the alley. Ruth unpacked her ledgers and spread them across the bed, cross-referencing her uncle's careful records with the forged loan documents. The more she studied them, the more convinced she became. The signatures were close, but not perfect. The dates didn't align with her uncle's known whereabouts, and the amounts were suspiciously round, the kind of numbers a forger would choose because they looked official. If she could get her hands on Calhoun's other loan files, she could prove a pattern. But Calhoun wasn't going to hand them over willingly, and she didn't have legal authority to demand them. She needed help. She needed someone who knew Cedar Creek's power structure, who could navigate the murky space between law and leverage. She needed Orson Turner. After dark, Ruth slipped out of the boarding house and made her way to the livery stable. The streets were quieter now, lit only by occasional lanterns hanging outside doorways. She heard laughter from the copper bell, a low hum of conversation from the hotel porch. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The livery was a long, low building that smelled of hay and horses. Ruth stepped inside. The interior was dim, lit by a single lantern hanging from a post. Orson stood near a stall, checking the hoof of a black gelding. He looked up when she entered, his face shadowed. "You came," he said. "You asked me to." Ruth crossed the stable floor, her boots crunching on straw. "What did you want to tell me?" Orson set the horse's hoof down and straightened. "Your uncle didn't die of heart failure," he said bluntly. "He was murdered." Ruth's breath caught. "What?" Orson's voice was low, controlled. "I can't prove it." "The doctor said heart failure, and that was that. But I found Samuel 2 days before he died. He was in his study at the ranch, going through his books. He told me someone had been altering his accounts, borrowing money in his name. He said he was going to report it to the county sheriff. Next day, he was dead." Ruth's hands clenched. "Calhoun killed him, or had him killed," Orson said. "Like I said, I can't prove it. But the timing's too convenient. Samuel dies, Calhoun shows up with forged notes, and suddenly Juniper Ranch is up for auction. Why didn't you say something?" Ruth demanded. "Why didn't you investigate?" Orson's expression darkened. "I tried. The county sheriff told me to drop it. Said Samuel was old. His heart gave out, and I was seeing conspiracies where there weren't any. When I kept pushing, the sheriff made it clear my job was on the line. So you gave up?" Ruth said, her voice sharp. Orson's jaw tightened. "I didn't give up. I've been gathering evidence, quietly. Calhoun's got too many people in his pocket for a direct approach. If I'd gone after him without proof, I'd be out of a job and Samuel's death would still be unsolved. But if you're willing to work with me, we might be able to bring him down." Ruth studied him. His face was hard, unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that looked like pain. "You cared about my uncle," she said softly. "He gave me a chance when no one else would," Orson said. "After the war, I was a mess. Couldn't sleep, couldn't settle, couldn't trust anyone. Samuel hired me to work the ranch for a season. Didn't ask questions, didn't push. Just let me be. When I left to take the deputy job, he told me I'd always have a place at Juniper if I needed it. His voice roughened. I need to make this right. Ruth felt the knot in her chest loosen slightly. All right, she said. Tell me what you know. Orson moved to a workbench and pulled out a folded map. He spread it across the bench, and Ruth leaned in. Calhoun's been targeting ranches along the creek, he said, pointing to marks on the map. Yours, the Whitaker place, the old Morrison homestead. All of them foreclosed in the last 6 months. All of them, using the same excuse. Unpaid loans that no one can verify. He's building a land empire, Ruth said. More than that. Orson traced a line along the map. There's talk the railroad's coming through next year. If Calhoun controls the land along the creek, he controls the water rights and the rail access. He'll be able to name his price. So he's not just stealing, Ruth said. He's planning, and he's got help. Orson straightened. I've been watching his movements. He meets with someone every Wednesday night, behind the land office. I haven't seen who it is, but whoever it is has access to county records. That's how he's getting the forgeries certified. Ruth's mind raced. If we can find out who's helping him, we can expose the whole scheme. Orson nodded. But we need proof. Hard evidence. Not just suspicions. Then we get it, Ruth said. She looked at him. What do you need from me? Orson met her eyes. Calhoun's having an auction next week. He's selling off livestock and equipment from the foreclosed ranches. If you go to the auction, you can get close to his records. He'll have files there, bills of sale, transfer documents. If you can get a look at them, you might find something we can use. And if I get caught, then you're in trouble, Orson said bluntly. But I'll be there. I'll watch your back. Ruth felt a shiver that wasn't entirely fear. There was something in the way Orson looked at her, steady and unblinking, that made her believe him. All right, she said. I'll do it. The auction was set for Saturday, 3 days before the ranch foreclosure deadline. Ruth spent the next 2 days preparing, studying auction procedures, memorizing Calhoun's known associates, and rehearsing her cover story. She'd pose as a buyer interested in equipment, use the chaos of the auction to slip into Calhoun's makeshift office, and search his files. It was a terrible plan. Ruth knew it. But it was the only plan they had. On Saturday morning, she dressed carefully. She wore her plainest skirt, a dark blouse, and pulled her hair back in a tight braid. She wanted to look like a working woman, someone who belonged at a ranch auction. She tucked a small notebook and pencil into her skirt pocket, tools she'd need if she found anything worth recording. The auction yard was on the edge of town, a sprawling open space with makeshift corrals and a raised platform for the auctioneer. By the time Ruth arrived, the place was crowded. Ranchers, merchants, drifters, all of them eyeing the livestock and equipment with varying degrees of interest. Ruth moved through the crowd, keeping her head down, searching for Calhoun. She found him near the platform, talking with a man in a black coat. Ruth couldn't hear the conversation, but the body language was clear. The man in the black coat was angry, gesturing sharply, while Calhoun remained calm, his expression placating. After a moment, the man in the black coat stalked off, and Calhoun turned back to the auction, his face unreadable. Ruth circled the yard, mapping exits and watching for Orson. She spotted him near the far corral, leaning against a fence post, his hat pulled low. He looked like just another rancher, bored and waiting. But Ruth saw the way his eyes tracked the crowd, the way his hand stayed near his gun. He was ready. The auction started. The auctioneer, a barrel-chested man with a voice like gravel, began calling out lots. A plow, a wagon, a dozen head of cattle. The bidding was brisk. Ruth watched, waiting for her moment. It came halfway through, when Calhoun stepped away from the platform and headed toward a small office tent set up near the corrals. Ruth waited a beat, then followed. She kept her distance, moving casually, as if she were just wandering the yard. When Calhoun disappeared into the tent, Ruth counted to 10, then slipped inside. The tent was cramped, filled with crates, a makeshift desk, and stacks of files. Calhoun wasn't there. Ruth's heart hammered. She moved to the desk and started flipping through papers. Bills of sale, transfer deeds, loan agreements. She scanned them quickly, looking for patterns, for names that repeated, for signatures that looked wrong. She found it in the third stack. A loan agreement for the Whitaker Ranch, signed by Thomas Whitaker. But Ruth knew Thomas Whitaker. He'd been a friend of her uncle's, a man who'd never borrowed a cent in his life. And the signature looked just like her uncle's forged notes. The same uneven pen pressure. The same too short flourish. Ruth pulled out her notebook and started copying details. Loan amount, date, witness signature. Her hands shook, but she kept writing. If she could get this information to a judge, she could prove Calhoun's pattern of fraud. The tent flap rustled. Ruth froze. She turned. Victor Calhoun stood in the entrance, his expression cold. Looking for something, Miss Sinclair? Ruth straightened, clutching the notebook. Just browsing. Calhoun stepped inside. You're trespassing. This is private property. So is my ranch, Ruth said. But that didn't stop you from stealing it. Calhoun's smile was thin. You're persistent. I'll give you that. But persistence without sense is just stubbornness. He moved closer. You should leave. Cedar Creek, Miss Sinclair. While you still can. Ruth backed toward the tent flap. I'm not leaving. Calhoun's eyes flicked to the notebook in her hand. What did you find? Nothing that belongs to you, Ruth said. She turned and pushed through the flap, her pulse racing. The auction yard noise hit her like a wave. She scanned the crowd, looking for Orson, and saw him already moving toward her, his face tight. But before she could reach him, a hand grabbed her arm. Ruth spun. A man she didn't recognize, tall and heavy, with a scarred face, held her tightly. Calhoun stepped out of the tent behind her. Take her to the wagon, he said quietly. Ruth tried to pull free, but the man's grip was iron. She opened her mouth to shout, but he clamped a hand over it and started dragging her toward the edge of the yard. Panic flared. She kicked hard, aiming for his shin, and he grunted, but didn't let go. Then Orson was there. He moved fast, his hand closing on the man's wrist. Let her go. The man turned, his scarred face twisting into a sneer. This ain't your business, Turner. It is now, Orson said. His voice was flat, dangerous. Let her go or I'll break your arm. The man hesitated, then shoved Ruth away. She stumbled, but caught herself. Orson stepped between them, his body a barrier. Ruth saw the way his hand hovered near his gun, the way his eyes stayed locked on the scarred man's face. Calhoun appeared at the scarred man's shoulder. "Deputy Turner," he said smoothly. "Miss Sinclair was trespassing in my office. I was simply escorting her off the premises." "By dragging her?" Orson's voice was ice. "That's not an escort. That's an assault." "A misunderstanding," Calhoun said. "I'm sure Miss Sinclair will agree to leave peacefully now. Won't you, Miss Sinclair?" Ruth's jaw tightened, but she nodded. Orson didn't move. He waited until Calhoun and the scarred man stepped back, then turned to Ruth. "Come on." They walked through the auction crowd together, Orson's hand light on her elbow, guiding her toward the street. Ruth's legs felt shaky, but she kept her head up. When they were out of sight of the auction yard, Orson stopped and turned to her. "Are you all right?" Ruth nodded. "I got what we needed." She pulled out the notebook. "Loan agreements. Forged signatures. The same pattern as my uncle's notes." Orson took the notebook and flipped through it. His expression darkened. "This is good. But it's not enough to take to a judge. We need more. We need proof that someone in the county office is helping him certify these forgeries." Ruth's mind was racing. Calhoun said someone meets him behind the land office every Wednesday night. That's 2 days from now. If we can see who it is, we'll have our proof. Orson looked at her. "That's risky. If Calhoun catches you spying on him, he won't stop at dragging you off. He'll make you disappear. Then we'll make sure he doesn't catch us," Ruth said. Orson studied her for a long moment. "You're not like other women I've met," he said finally. "I'll take that as a compliment," Ruth said. "It is." His mouth twitched, almost a smile. "All right. Wednesday night. We'll stake out the land office. But you do exactly what I say. No improvising." "Agreed," Ruth said. They spent the next 2 days planning. Orson walked Ruth through the layout of the land office, the best vantage points, the escape routes if things went wrong. Ruth tried not to think about all the ways this could fail. She focused on the details, the practicalities, the small tasks that would keep her hands busy and her mind from spinning. On Tuesday evening, she sat in her boarding house room, staring at her uncle's ledgers. She'd been over them 100 times, but she kept coming back, looking for something she'd missed. A clue, a pattern. Anything that would make sense of why Samuel Sinclair had been murdered. A knock at the door startled her. Ruth stood and opened it. Orson stood in the hallway, his hat in his hands. "Can I come in?" Ruth stepped back. He entered, glancing around the small room, then turned to her. "I wanted to talk before tomorrow night." Ruth nodded. "All right." Orson set his hat on the washstand. "If this goes wrong," he said, "if Calhoun realizes we're onto him, you need to leave Cedar Creek immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to fight. Just go." "I'm not leaving," Ruth said. "You might not have a choice." Orson's voice was rough. "Calhoun's killed before. He'll kill again if he thinks you're a threat." Ruth met his eyes. "You're staying. Why should I leave?" "Because I don't have anything left to lose," Orson said quietly. "You do. You have the ranch. You have a future. I've got a deputy badge and a past I can't outrun." "What past?" Ruth asked. Orson looked away. "The war. What I did. What I saw. He paused. I was a sharpshooter. I killed men from so far away I couldn't see their faces. When it was over, I thought I'd leave it behind. But it follows you. The memory of it. The weight. Ruth stepped closer. My uncle trusted you. That's enough for me. Orson's jaw worked. Your uncle saw something in me I don't see in myself. Maybe he saw the truth, Ruth said. And you're just too close to it. Orson looked at her then, and the guard in his eyes dropped for just a moment. Ruth saw the exhaustion, the loneliness, the quiet ache of a man who'd spent too long holding himself apart. She reached out and touched his arm, the same gesture she'd made days ago in the street, but this time it felt different. Less demand, more connection. Thank you, she said, for helping me, for caring about my uncle, for not giving up. Orson's hand covered hers. His palm was warm, calloused. I won't let Calhoun take your ranch, he said. I promise. The air between them shifted. Ruth felt the pull, the undeniable gravity of two people standing too close in a small room, both of them tired. Both of them afraid. Both of them needing something they didn't have words for. Orson's thumb brushed the back of her hand. A gesture so small it might have been accidental. But Ruth knew it wasn't. She should step back. She should keep this professional. But she didn't. Instead, she said, what happens after we stop Calhoun? Orson's eyes searched hers. I don't know. Do you ever think about staying? Ruth asked. At the ranch. The way my uncle wanted. Every day, Orson said quietly. But wanting something and deserving it are two different things. What if you're wrong? Ruth said. What if you deserve more than you think? Orson didn't answer. He just looked at her, his expression raw, and Ruth saw the war he was fighting inside himself. The battle between hope and self-doubt. She wanted to tell him it was all right, that he didn't have to be perfect, that being willing was enough. But before she could find the words, he pulled his hand away and picked up his hat. I should go, he said. Tomorrow night, midnight. Meet me at the livery. Ruth nodded. She watched him leave, the door closing softly behind him, and felt the ache settle in her chest. She'd come to Cedar Creek to save a ranch. She hadn't expected to care about a man who wore his scars like armor and couldn't see his own worth. Wednesday dragged. Ruth tried to keep busy, reviewing her notes, checking her supplies, anything to keep from thinking too hard about what could go wrong. But by evening, her nerves were frayed. She ate a quiet supper at the boarding house, barely tasting the food, then returned to her room to wait. At midnight, she slipped out. The streets were dark, the town asleep. Ruth made her way to the livery, her heart pounding. Orson was already there, a shadow in the doorway. He nodded when he saw her and handed her a dark shawl. Wrap this around you. It'll help you blend in. Ruth pulled the shawl over her shoulders. They left the livery and moved through the back alleys, avoiding the main street. The land office was a 2-story building near the center of town, its windows dark. Orson led Ruth to a narrow alley behind the building, where crates and barrels provided cover. We wait here, he whispered. If anyone comes, stay low and stay quiet. They crouched behind the crates. The minutes stretched. Ruth's legs cramped, but she didn't move. The night was cold, the wind sharp. She could hear Orson breathing beside her, steady and controlled. Then, footsteps. Ruth tensed. A figure appeared at the back door of the land office, moving quickly. In the faint moonlight, Ruth saw the outline of a man in a long coat. He knocked twice, paused, then knocked once more. The door opened, and another figure appeared. Calhoun. The two men spoke in low voices. Ruth strained to hear, but couldn't make out the words. Then the first man stepped into the light cast by Calhoun's lantern, and Ruth's breath caught. It was Howard Marsh. Ruth felt the ground drop out from under her. Marsh, her uncle's lawyer. The man who'd sent for her, who'd promised to help. He was working with Calhoun. Orson's hand closed on her wrist, a silent warning. Ruth stayed frozen, her mind reeling. She watched as Marsh handed Calhoun a folder, watched as Calhoun opened it and nodded, satisfied. Then Marsh turned and walked away, disappearing into the night. Calhoun went back inside. The door closed. Orson tugged Ruth's wrist, and they moved, quick and silent, back through the alleys to the livery. Once inside, Orson released her, and Ruth sagged against a post, her breath coming hard. "Marsh," she said. It was Marsh. Orson nodded grimly. He's the one with access to the county records. He's been certifying Calhoun's forgeries as legitimate. Ruth felt sick. I trusted him. My uncle trusted him. He played you, Orson said. Played both of us. He brought you here to make it look like the foreclosure was legitimate. If you tried to fight and failed, no one would question Calhoun's claim. But we have proof now, Ruth said. We saw them together. We can go to the county sheriff. Orson shook his head. The county sheriff's in Calhoun's pocket too. Remember? He's the one who shut down my investigation into your uncle's death. If we go to him, we'll disappear. Then what do we do? Ruth demanded. The auction's in 2 days. If we don't stop this now, I lose the ranch. Orson paced the stable floor, thinking. Finally, he stopped. We need leverage. Something so damaging that Calhoun and Marsh have no choice but to back off. Like what? Orson looked at her. We need the original forgeries, the ones Marsh certified. If we can get those, we can take them to the territorial judge. He's not part of Calhoun's network. He'll have to act. Those files are in the land office, Ruth said. Locked up. Orson's jaw tightened. Then we break in. When? Tonight. Orson checked his gun. We don't have time to wait. Ruth's heart hammered. This was beyond risky. This was criminal. But what choice did they have? All right, she said. Let's go. They moved through the dark streets again, this time heading straight for the land office. The building was silent, its windows black. Orson circled to the back door, the same one Marsh had used. He knelt and pulled a small metal tool from his pocket. Ruth watched as he worked the lock, his hands steady. After a minute, the lock clicked, and the door swung open. Inside, the building was pitch dark. Orson lit a match, shielding the flame with his hand. The weak light revealed a hallway, a staircase, and several closed doors. Marsh's office is upstairs, Ruth whispered. That's where he keeps the county records. They climbed the stairs, each step creaking under their weight. Ruth's pulse pounded in her ears. At the top, Orson pushed open the door to Marsh's office. The room was neat, almost obsessively so, with files stacked in perfect rows on the shelves. Orson moved to the desk and started opening drawers. Ruth went to the shelves. She scanned the labels, looking for anything related to loans, foreclosures, or land transfers. Her fingers found a file marked Sinclair, Samuel. She pulled it out and opened it. Inside were the forged loan documents, along with a notarized statement from Marsh certifying the signatures as genuine. "Got it," Ruth whispered. Orson joined her. He flipped through the file, then pulled out several more. Whitaker, Morrison, Fletcher. All the foreclosed ranches, all certified by Marsh. This is what we need. A sound from downstairs froze them both. Footsteps. Someone was entering the building. Orson blew out the match. Darkness swallowed them. Ruth's breath came shallow and fast. Orson grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the window. "They can't find us here," he whispered. The window overlooked a narrow alley. Orson opened it slowly, wincing at the creak of old wood. The footsteps were climbing the stairs now. Orson gestured to Ruth. "Go." Ruth climbed onto the windowsill, the files clutched against her chest. The drop was maybe 10 feet. She took a breath and jumped, landing hard on the packed dirt below. Pain shot through her ankle, but she bit down on the cry. Orson landed beside her a second later, his hand steadying her. "Move." They ran. Behind them, a shout. Someone had seen them. Ruth's ankle throbbed, but she pushed through the pain, Orson's hand on her arm, guiding her through the maze of alleys. They burst onto the main street, startling a stray dog, and kept running. The boarding house was too obvious, the livery too exposed. Orson pulled Ruth toward the edge of town, toward the open land beyond. They didn't stop until they reached a small grove of cottonwoods a half-mile out. Ruth collapsed against a tree, gasping for air. Orson crouched beside her, listening. After a long moment, he relaxed slightly. "I think we lost them." Ruth looked at the files still clutched in her hands. "We did it. We got the proof." Orson nodded. "Now we just have to stay alive long enough to use it." They stayed in the grove until dawn, too afraid to move, too exhausted to do more than wait. When the first light crept over the horizon, Orson helped Ruth to her feet. Her ankle was swollen, but she could walk. They made their way back to town slowly, staying off the main roads. By the time they reached the livery, the sun was up and Cedar Creek was waking. Orson led Ruth inside and barred the door. "We can't stay here long," he said. "Once Marsh realizes those files are missing, he'll know it was us." "How long do we have?" Ruth asked. "Not long. Maybe a few hours." Orson looked at the files. "The territorial judge is in Silver Ridge, 2 days' ride from here. If we leave now, we can make it." Ruth shook her head. "The auction's tomorrow. If we leave, Calhoun takes the ranch by default. If we stay, Calhoun takes us," Orson said. "Ruth, we can fight this in court after we get to Silver Ridge. But we can't fight it if we're dead." Ruth looked at the files, then at Orson. "There has to be another way." Orson rubbed his face, exhaustion written in every line. "What are you thinking?" Ruth's mind raced. "What if we force Calhoun's hand? What if we go public? Bring the whole town to the auction, show them the proof, make it impossible for him to bury this." That's a terrible idea, Orson said flatly. Calhoun will have men there. Armed men. If you try to expose him in public, it'll turn into a bloodbath. Then we make sure we're not alone, Ruth said. We bring the ranchers whose land Calhoun stole. We bring the townspeople who've been too afraid to speak up. We make it so big Calhoun can't silence us without revealing himself. Orson stared at her. You're serious? I'm serious, Ruth said. This is my home, my family's legacy. I'm not running. Orson closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they were resigned. All right. But we do this smart. We gather people we trust. We make a plan. And we go in ready for a fight. Ruth nodded. Let's start. They spent the rest of the day moving carefully through Cedar Creek, visiting the families whose ranches had been foreclosed. The Whitakers were first. Thomas Whitaker listened to Ruth and Orson with a skeptical expression. But when Ruth showed him the forged loan documents with his signature, his face went pale. I never borrowed that money, he said. I told Marsh that, but he said the bank had proof. The bank lied, Ruth said. Marsh certified the forgeries. He's working with Calhoun. If we expose them tomorrow at the auction, we can stop this. Whitaker looked at Orson. You believe her? I've seen the proof, Orson said. Your signature's a fake. So is Samuel Sinclair's. So are half a dozen others. Calhoun's been stealing land for months. Whitaker's hands clenched. What do you need from me? Come to the auction, Ruth said. Bring your family. Bring anyone you trust. When I show the proof, I need people to stand with me. Whitaker nodded slowly. I'll be there. They visited 3 more families that day. Each conversation tense. Each decision hard won. But by evening, Ruth and Orson had commitments from a dozen families. It wasn't an army, but it was enough to make noise. Enough to force Calhoun into the open. That night, Ruth and Orson met at the livery one last time. Tomorrow's going to be bad, Orson said. You understand that, right? Calhoun's not going to let this happen without a fight. I understand, Ruth said. Orson looked at her. If it comes down to it, if things go wrong, I want you to run. Don't wait for me. Just run. Ruth stepped closer. I'm not leaving you behind. You might have to, Orson said quietly. Ruth shook her head. We started this together. We finish it together. Orson's hand came up, hesitant, and touched her cheek. The gesture was so careful, so tentative, that Ruth's throat tightened. You're the most stubborn woman I've ever met, he said. Good, Ruth said. Because I'm not done being stubborn. Orson smiled. A real smile this time, and for a moment the exhaustion and fear lifted. Then he leaned in and kissed her. Soft and brief and full of everything neither of them had the words to say. When he pulled back, his eyes held hers. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, I'm glad I met you. Ruth's heart ached. Me too. The auction day arrived cold and clear. Ruth dressed in her best skirt and blouse, her hair braided neatly. She looked at herself in the small mirror in her boarding house room and barely recognized the woman staring back. A week ago, she'd been a bookkeeper in Kansas City, quiet and careful. Now she was about to stand in front of a crowd and accuse one of the most powerful men in the territory of murder and fraud. She met Orson at the auction yard. He looked grim, his duster buttoned tight, his gun belt visible. The yard was already filling with people, more than Ruth had expected. She saw the Whitakers, the Morrisons, families she'd visited yesterday. But she also saw faces she didn't know. Townspeople drawn by curiosity or gossip. Calhoun stood near the platform, talking with the auctioneer. He looked calm, confident. Ruth's stomach twisted. Orson touched her arm. "Stay close to me. When I give the signal, you make your move." Ruth nodded. The auctioneer climbed onto the platform and called for attention. The crowd quieted. "Ladies and gentlemen," the auctioneer began. "Welcome to today's auction. We'll be starting with livestock, followed by equipment and land parcels. Let's begin with lot number 1. The auction proceeded. Ruth watched, waiting, her pulse a steady drumbeat in her ears. Lot after lot sold, the auctioneer's voice rising and falling. Then, finally, he called out, "Lot 47. Juniper Ranch, 160 acres along Cedar Creek. Prime grazing land. Starting bid, $500. Ruth stepped forward. She raised her voice. "I contest this auction." The crowd murmured. The auctioneer frowned. "Ma'am, if you have a dispute, you'll need to take it up with the seller after the auction." "The seller is a fraud," Ruth said loudly. "And I have proof." Calhoun turned, his face darkening. He started toward her, but Orson stepped into his path, his hand resting on his gun. Calhoun stopped. Ruth pulled the files from her bag and held them up. "Victor Calhoun has been forging loan documents and stealing land from families across this county. These files prove it. They show forged signatures, falsified loans, and illegal foreclosures. Howard Marsh, the county clerk, has been certifying the forgeries." The crowd erupted. Voices overlapped, angry and confused. The auctioneer banged his gavel, but no one paid attention. Calhoun's face went white, then red. "You have no authority to make these accusations," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "I have the proof," Ruth said. She opened the first file and held up the document. "This is a loan agreement for the Whitaker Ranch, signed by Thomas Whitaker. But Thomas Whitaker never borrowed this money. The signature is a forgery." She pulled out another file. "This is the same for the Morrison place and the Fletcher homestead and my uncle's ranch. All forged. All certified by Howard Marsh." Thomas Whitaker stepped forward. "She's telling the truth. I never signed that paper." Other voices joined in. The Morrisons, the Fletchers, more families Ruth hadn't even spoken to. The crowd's anger turned toward Calhoun. He backed toward the platform, his expression twisting. "This is a lie," he said. "A conspiracy to defame me." "Then explain these," Ruth said. She held up the files. "Explain why every foreclosed ranch in this county has the same pattern. Explain why Howard Marsh certified documents that are clearly fake. Where is Marsh?" Someone in the crowd shouted. Ruth scanned the yard. Marsh was nowhere to be seen. "He ran," she said, "because he knows he's guilty." Calhoun's hand moved toward his coat. Orson's gun was out in a heartbeat, aimed steady at Calhoun's chest. "Don't," Orson said. Calhoun froze. The yard went silent. "You're making a mistake, Turner," Calhoun said. "I have friends, powerful friends. If you do this, you'll regret it." "I already regret plenty," Orson said. Adding you to the list won't make much difference. A figure pushed through the crowd. The scarred man from the auction, Calhoun's enforcer. He had his gun drawn. Orson's attention split for just a second, and Calhoun lunged, grabbing for Ruth. She twisted away, but Calhoun caught her arm, yanking her off balance. The files scattered across the platform. Orson spun, but the scarred man fired. The shot went wide, splintering wood on the platform. The crowd screamed and scattered. Orson returned fire, his shot hitting the scarred man in the shoulder. The man went down, cursing. Calhoun dragged Ruth toward the edge of the platform, using her as a shield. Orson tracked him with his gun, but didn't have a clear shot. "Let her go, Calhoun," Orson said. "Not a chance," Calhoun said. He was breathing hard, his grip on Ruth's arm bruising. "This ends now. The ranch is mine. She's nothing." Ruth stomped down hard on Calhoun's instep. He yelped, and his grip loosened. She wrenched free and dove off the platform. Orson was there, catching her, pulling her behind him. Calhoun raised his own gun, aiming at Orson. The shot rang out, but it didn't come from Calhoun. Thomas Whitaker stood at the edge of the crowd, his rifle smoking. Calhoun staggered, clutching his side, and dropped his gun. He fell to his knees, blood spreading across his expensive suit. The yard was silent, except for Calhoun's labored breathing. Orson kept his gun trained on him. "It's over," Orson said. Calhoun looked up, his face pale. "You don't know what you've done," he gasped. "There are others. This won't stop. Then we'll deal with them too," Ruth said. She stepped forward, picking up the scattered files. "But you're done." Calhoun collapsed onto the platform. The crowd began to move again, some rushing to help the wounded, scarred man, others gathering around Calhoun. Orson holstered his gun and turned to Ruth. "Are you hurt?" Ruth shook her head. "I'm fine." The territorial judge arrived in Cedar Creek 2 days later. Ruth and Orson presented the files, along with testimony from the foreclosed families. The judge reviewed the evidence with a grim expression, then issued arrest warrants for Victor Calhoun and Howard Marsh. Calhoun, still recovering from his gunshot wound, was taken into custody. Marsh was found trying to board a stage out of the territory and arrested at the station. The foreclosures were overturned. Juniper Ranch, along with the other stolen properties, was returned to its rightful owners. Ruth stood on the porch of her uncle's ranch house, looking out over the land she'd fought so hard to save, and felt the weight of the past week finally lift. Orson found her there that evening. He leaned against the porch railing, his hat in his hands. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Ruth corrected. Orson smiled faintly. "I guess we did." He looked out at the horizon. "What happens now?" Ruth glanced at him. "What do you want to happen?" Orson was quiet for a long moment. "I've been thinking about what your uncle said. About always having a place here if I needed it." Ruth's heart beat faster. And I think I need it," Orson said. "If you'll have me." Ruth stepped closer. "I'll have you." She reached for his hand. "But only if you stop thinking you don't deserve it." Orson looked at their joined hands, then at her face. "I'll try." "That's all I'm asking," Ruth said. Orson pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her. They stood together on the porch as the sun set over Juniper Ranch, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It wasn't a perfect ending, There were still scars to heal, still battles to fight. But for the first time in a long time, both of them felt like they'd found something worth holding on to. A month later, Ruth stood in the church in Cedar Creek, wearing a simple dress the color of cream. Her hair loose for once, falling in soft waves over her shoulders. Orson stood beside her in a clean shirt and vest, his hair trimmed, his face shaved, looking almost uncomfortable in the unfamiliar formality. The church was packed with the families they'd helped, the townspeople who'd stood with them, the ranchers who'd gotten their land back. The preacher spoke about love and commitment, about choosing each other in hardship and in hope. Ruth barely heard the words. She was too focused on Orson's hand holding hers, steady and sure. When the preacher asked if she would take this man, she said yes without hesitation. When Orson said the same, his voice was quiet, but certain. They kissed, and the church erupted in applause. Ruth laughed against Orson's mouth, feeling lighter than she had in years. Outside, the town had organized a celebration. Tables lined the street, laden with food. A fiddler struck up a tune. Children ran between the tables, laughing. Orson pulled Ruth into a dance, his hand on her waist, her hand on his shoulder. He wasn't a graceful dancer, but he tried, and that was enough. "You're stuck with me now," he said. "Good," Ruth said. "I wasn't planning on letting you go anyway." They danced until the sun set, until the lanterns were lit, until the music slowed and the crowd thinned. Then, Orson took Ruth's hand and led her away from the celebration, back toward the ranch. They rode together on his black gelding, Ruth seated in front of him, his arms around her, keeping her safe. At the ranch, Orson dismounted and helped Ruth down. She looked up at the house, at the warm light glowing in the windows, at the land stretching out under the stars. "This is home," she said softly. Orson stood behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist. "Yes," he said, "it is." They went inside together, closing the door on the past and opening it to whatever came next. It wouldn't always be easy. There would be hard seasons, difficult choices, moments when the weight of what they'd been through threatened to pull them under. But they'd face it together, and that made all the difference. Spring came to Juniper Ranch with a riot of wildflowers and new calves. Ruth worked the books in her uncle's old study, keeping the accounts with the same meticulous care Samuel had taught her. Orson worked the land, mending fences, tending livestock, his restlessness finally settling into purpose. In the evenings, they sat on the porch together, watching the sun set, talking about plans for the future. Ruth discovered she was pregnant in May. She told Orson while they were fixing a section of fence near the creek. He stared at her for a long moment, then pulled her into his arms and held her so tight she could barely breathe. "Are you sure?" he asked. "I'm sure," Ruth said. Orson pulled back, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching hers. "I don't know how to be a father." "You didn't know how to be a rancher either," Ruth said. "But you learned." Orson laughed, a sound Ruth didn't hear often enough. "All right. We'll learn together." The baby, a girl, was born in January during a snowstorm that shut down Cedar Creek for 3 days. Orson paced the ranch house like a caged animal while Ruth labored, and when the midwife finally let him in, he sat beside the bed and took his daughter in his arms with a tenderness that made Ruth's heart break open all over again. They named her Sarah, after Ruth's mother. Sarah Sinclair Turner. She had Orson's gray eyes and Ruth's stubborn chin. and she cried louder than seemed possible for someone so small. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm. There were good years and hard years. Seasons when the rain came, and seasons when it didn't. Victor Calhoun died in prison 2 years after his arrest. Howard Marsh served 5 years and left the territory, never to return. The scars from that week in Cedar Creek faded, but never disappeared entirely. Orson kept his deputy badge for another year, then resigned to focus on the ranch. He never talked much about the war, but sometimes Ruth would wake in the night to find him standing by the window, staring out at the dark land. And she'd go to him and hold him until the ghosts retreated. On Sarah's 3rd birthday, they held a party at the ranch. The Whitakers came, and the Morrisons, and half the town. The children played in the yard while the adults gathered on the porch, trading stories and laughter. Ruth stood with Orson's arm around her waist, watching Sarah chase a puppy through the grass, and felt a gratitude so deep it was almost painful. "You did good," Orson said quietly. "We did good," Ruth corrected, the same way she always did. Orson kissed her temple. "Yeah, we did." As the sun set over Juniper Ranch, painting the sky in shades of rose and amber, Ruth leaned into her husband's warmth and thought about the woman she'd been when she first arrived in Cedar Creek. That woman had been afraid, angry, desperate. She'd come to save a ranch and ended up finding something far more valuable. A home, a partner, a future. It hadn't been easy. It hadn't been simple. But it had been worth every hard-won step, and she wouldn't trade it for anything. Years passed. Sarah grew into a bright, headstrong girl who loved the ranch as fiercely as Ruth had loved her uncle's legacy. She learned to ride before she could read, learned to keep books before she turned 10, learned to stand her ground the way her parents had taught her. Orson's hair went silver at the temples, but his hands stayed steady. Ruth's face gained lines, but her eyes stayed sharp. They worked the ranch side by side, built a life that was solid and real, raised a daughter who knew her own worth. Sometimes, on quiet evenings, they'd sit on the porch and remember that first week. The gun aimed at Ruth's spine, the forged documents, the standoff at the auction. It felt like another lifetime, a story that had happened to different people, but it wasn't. It was their story, the beginning of everything that mattered. And every time Ruth looked at Orson, every time he reached for her hand without thinking, every time Sarah ran through the door with scraped knees and wild joy, Ruth was reminded that some things were worth fighting for. Some people were worth staying for. Love wasn't just a feeling. It was a choice made over and over, in small moments and big ones, in hardship and in peace. And Ruth Sinclair Turner had made her choice the day she stood in a dusty street with a gun at her back and decided not to run. She'd chosen to stay, to fight, to love, and she'd never regretted it.